The night I finally left him, there was no dramatic showdown. No thrown plates or screamed ultimatums. Just the quiet sound of my suitcase wheels rolling across our apartment floor while he lay passed out on the couch, an empty bottle of whiskey tipped over on the coffee table. The same coffee table where we'd shared breakfast 3 years earlier on our first morning living together. The same coffee table where he proposed, sober and full of promises. I remember pausing at the door, my hand on the knob, waiting for something. A sign, perhaps. A reason to stay one more night. One more chance. But the only sound was his labored breathing and the tick-tick-tick of the vintage wall clock his mother had given us. Time marching forward, even when lives stand still. I didn't cry then. The tears would come later, in waves that threatened to drown me. But in that moment, I felt nothing but the weight lifting from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying until it was gone. My name is Emma, and this is the story of how I fell in love with an alcoholic, lost myself trying to save him, and finally learned that some people can only be rescued by themselves. This is my journey through the wreckage of toxic love. I met Michael at my best friend's wedding. He was the charming groomsman who made everyone laugh during his toast, who danced with the flower girl and helped the elderly guests to their cars. He had exactly 2 drinks that night. I counted, though I didn't know then why I felt compelled to notice such a detail. Later, I would count his drinks obsessively, my stomach nodding with each one past the threshold I'd mentally established as safe. But that night, he was just a handsome man with kind eyes who asked for my number as Frank Sinatra played in the background. The romance of it all was intoxicating. "You're different," he told me on our 3rd date, his fingers intertwined with mine across the restaurant table. "I feel like I can be myself around you." I didn't understand then what being himself truly meant. I didn't recognize the warning signs when he canceled our 4th date with a vague excuse about feeling under the weather. Or when he showed up late to our 5th date, smelling faintly of mint mouthwash that didn't quite mask what lay beneath. Love is blinding that way. Or perhaps I simply saw what I wanted to see. A successful architect with dreams of his own firm someday. A man who quoted poetry and remembered how I took my coffee. A man who looked at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. The first time I saw him truly drunk was 2 months into our relationship. We'd gone to a colleague's birthday party at an upscale bar downtown. I'd stepped away to use the restroom, and when I returned, something had shifted. His eyes were glassy, his laugh too loud. He'd had 3 shots in the 5 minutes I was gone. "Let's get you home," I said softly, my hand on his arm. He jerked away, annoyance flashing across his face. "I'm fine. Stop mothering me." That word, mothering, would become a weapon in his arsenal. Any concern, any question about his drinking was dismissed as controlling behavior on my part. But that night, he quickly softened, apologized, blamed work stress, and let me guide him to a taxi. The next morning, he showed up at my apartment with coffee and croissants, embarrassment written across his features. "I'm sorry about last night," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I've been under a lot of pressure with this new project. It won't happen again." I believed him. Of course I did. Because when he wasn't drinking, Michael was everything I'd ever wanted. Attentive, passionate, ambitious. And when he looked at me with those remorseful eyes, I couldn't help but remember my own father's struggle with alcohol, how my mother had given up on him too quickly, how he died alone. Maybe that's why I stayed through the first broken promise. And the 10th. And the 100th. Maybe that's why, when the red flags waved so violently they created their own wind, I still chose to believe that love could conquer addiction. I was wrong. What I didn't understand then, what took me years of therapy to fully grasp, was that Michael's battle wasn't mine to fight. And that by trying to save him, I was slowly disappearing, one piece at a time, like a puzzle being disassembled until the original picture was unrecognizable. But that understanding was still far away on the night he first told me he loved me, his breath clear, his eyes bright with sincerity, his hands steady as they cupped my face. I melted into those 3 words, letting them wrap around me like a blanket against the cold reality I was choosing to ignore. "I love you too," I whispered back, sealing a pact with myself that I would be different from my mother. I would stay. I would help. I would save him. It was the most devastating promise I ever made. They say addiction wears a mask, and Michael's was crafted to perfection. To our friends, our families, even his colleagues, he was the epitome of success and charm. The consummate professional who sometimes worked too hard and needed to blow off steam. No one saw what happened behind closed doors. No one except me. 6 months into our relationship, I began cataloging the patterns. Monday through Wednesday, he'd come home from work clear-headed, sometimes bringing flowers or takeout from my favorite Thai place. We'd talk about our days, make love, fall asleep in each other's arms like characters in a romance novel. I'd wake up those mornings feeling grateful, hopeful, convinced that the worst was behind us. Thursday was the pivot day. Sometimes he'd make it home sober, sometimes not. I learned to gauge his state from the sound of his key in the lock, the fumbling jangle that meant I should prepare myself, the swift click that meant we'd have one more good night. Fridays and Saturdays belonged to alcohol. He had a system, you see. He'd start with beer, just to relax, then graduate to whiskey as the night progressed. 1 drink became 3, became 5, became too many to count. His transformation was like watching Jekyll become Hyde. The warm eyes turning cold, the gentle hands becoming clumsy and sometimes cruel, the loving words sharpening into weapons aimed at my deepest insecurities. "You're suffocating me," he'd slur when I suggested maybe he'd had enough. "You think you're so perfect," he'd sneer when I refused to join him in that 5th or 6th drink. "This is why your last boyfriend left you," he'd hiss, the alcohol excavating cruel truths I'd shared in moments of intimacy and reshaping them into ammunition. Sundays were for remorse. He'd wake late, pallid and shaking, eyes bloodshot and unable to meet mine. These were the days of apologies, of promises, of "I don't deserve you," and "I'll get help," and "It won't happen again." He'd be tender then, vulnerable in his shame, and I'd see glimpses of the man I fell in love with, the man I was certain still existed beneath the addiction. I became an expert at navigating these cycles. I learned to schedule dinners with friends early in the week, to make excuses for his absences on weekends, to keep Advil and Gatorade on hand for those Sunday mornings. I became adept at applying concealer to the shadows under my eyes, at forcing smiles when colleagues asked about my relationship, at deflecting my mother's concerned questions with practiced ease. "He's under a lot of pressure at work," I'd say, the lie bitter on my tongue. "It's just a rough patch," I'd insist, even as the rough patch stretched into months, then years. The most dangerous part wasn't the lying to others, it was the lying to myself. I constructed elaborate justifications for his behavior, for my tolerance of it. I compared our situation to others I deemed worse. At least he never hit me. At least he still had his job. At least he apologized. At least. I clung to the good moments like life preservers in a stormy sea. The surprise weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast where he stayed sober the entire time. The way he held my hand during my grandmother's funeral, steady and strong when I needed him most. The blueprint for our dream house he drew one Sunday afternoon, down to the reading nook by the bay window he knew I'd always wanted. "This is where we'll grow old together," he'd promised, his eyes clear and sincere. I taped that drawing to our refrigerator, a tangible reminder of what we could have if only the alcohol would loosen its grip. A beautiful lie we both desperately wanted to believe. The first intervention came at the 1-year mark of our relationship. His brother James flew in from Seattle, his best friend Tony took a day off work, and I spent hours rehearsing what I would say, how I would make him see what was happening to us. We sat in our living room, the 3 of us forming a triangle around him, our words carefully chosen, our voices gentle but firm. James spoke of their father's alcoholism, of the genetic predisposition they both carried. Tony mentioned the client meeting Michael had botched after a 3-martini lunch. And I tried to explain how the drinking was eroding not just his health, but the foundation of our relationship. Michael listened in silence, his face a mask I couldn't read. When we finished, he stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. For one hopeful moment, I thought we'd gotten through to him. "I appreciate your concern," he said finally, his voice measured reasonable. "But I don't have a problem. I work hard. I'm entitled to relax. Emma's being dramatic. You know how she gets." He looked at me then, a silent challenge in his eyes, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the fear of pushing too hard, of losing him entirely. "Maybe I've been overreacting," I heard myself say, the betrayal of my own truth radiating through me like poison. James and Tony exchanged glances. They'd seen what I'd just done, how quickly I'd capitulated, how easily I'd validated Michael's denial. In their eyes, I saw a mixture of disappointment and pity that burned worse than any accusation. After they left, Michael was solicitous, grateful. He ordered my favorite pizza, suggested we watch that documentary I'd been wanting to see. He didn't drink that night, or the next, or even that weekend. It was the pattern, the temporary improvement that kept hope alive, that convinced me my sacrifice had been worthwhile. 3 alcohol-free weeks later, he came home with a small velvet box and got down on one knee in our living room. "You stood by me," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You believed in me when no one else did. I want to be the man you deserve, Emma. Marry me." The ring was vintage, Art Deco, exactly my style. Later, I would wonder if he'd chosen it himself or if his assistant had helped, knowing how his eyes glazed over when I talked about jewelry or fashion. But in that moment, all I saw was the promise of the future we'd planned, the house with the reading nook, the life unburdened by the specter of addiction. "Yes," I said, because despite everything I loved him. Because I believed people could change if given enough love, enough chances. Because saying no would mean admitting I'd wasted a year of my life on someone who would never be what I needed. He swept me into his arms, spinning me around our apartment, both of us laughing through tears. That night, we made love with an intensity that felt like rebirth, like the sealing of a covenant. The next evening, I came home from work to find him celebrating our engagement with a bottle of champagne. "Just this once," he said, pouring me a glass. "For a special occasion." I should have known then that sobriety, like so many of his promises, was temporary. That just this once would become, just on weekends would become, "I can handle it," would become, "get off my back." But I slipped the ring onto my finger, touched glasses with the man I'd agreed to marry, and drank deeply of the beautiful lie we created together. A lie that would sustain and destroy me in equal measure for the next 2 years of my life. Our engagement changed things, though not in the way I'd hoped. The ring on my finger became both a promise and a prison, a glittering reminder of what we could be and a shackle binding me to what we actually were. Looking back, I can see how my identity began to blur at the edges, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Before Michael, I was known for my independence. I had close friends, a book club I never missed, a reputation at work for being the one who stayed late to perfect a presentation. I ran half marathons, volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends, called my mother every Sunday without fail. I had opinions and boundaries and dreams that were distinctly my own. But loving an alcoholic is like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open. You pour and pour and pour yourself in, yet the water level never rises. Eventually, you have nothing left to give, and still it's not enough. The first thing to go was my running. The weekend mornings I once spent on trails through the park were now devoted to nursing Michael through hangovers or walking on eggshells around his irritability. My running shoes gathered dust by the door, a small death I tried not to mourn. Next went the book club. After canceling 3 meetings in a row because Michael was not feeling well or needed me at home, I stopped receiving the email notifications altogether. When I ran into Sarah, the group's organizer at the grocery store, she looked at me with such naked concern that I had to pretend to receive an urgent call just to escape her gaze. "We miss you," she said before I could flee. "Whatever's going on, we're here for you." I nodded, throat tight, and hurried away. The truth was, I had stopped reading entirely. Books had always been my refuge, but now they felt like an indulgence I couldn't afford, a luxury incompatible with the vigilance my relationship demanded. Work suffered next. The promotion I'd been working toward went to a colleague who didn't have to leave early for family emergencies, code for. Michael called, slurring his words, having lost his keys/wallet/phone. My boss, once my mentor, began giving me simpler projects, her disappointment palpable in the gentle way she asked if everything was all right at home. "Everything's fine," I assured her, the lie so practiced it no longer stuck in my throat. "Just wedding stress." The wedding. We'd set a date for the following spring, a small ceremony in a garden with wildflowers and string lights. I threw myself into planning with desperate energy, as if the perfect centerpieces and carefully curated playlist could somehow transform our reality. As if wife would succeed where girlfriend and fiancé had failed. My mother voiced her concerns during a rare lunch together, her hands clutching mine across the table, her eyes searching my face for the daughter she recognized. "You've lost weight," she said, not unkindly. "And you never call anymore." "I'm just busy with the wedding," I replied, the familiar script ready on my lips. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Is he like your father?" The question landed like a slap. My father, who'd chosen the bottle over his family time and again. My father, whose addiction had left my mother raising 2 children alone, working double shifts and falling asleep at the kitchen table over bills she could barely pay. My father, who died of liver failure before he could meet his grandchildren or make amends for the years he'd thrown away. "Michael is nothing like Dad," I insisted, anger flaring hot and defensive. "He has a stressful job. Sometimes he drinks to unwind. It's completely different." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart, that's exactly what I used to say." I left the restaurant without finishing my meal, furious at her for seeing what I was trying so hard to ignore. I didn't call her for weeks after that. Another thread connecting me to my former self snipped away. The isolation happened so gradually I barely noticed it. Friends stopped inviting us to dinner after Michael showed up, drunk one too many times. Family gatherings became anxiety-inducing exercises in damage control. Even my sister, my closest confidant since childhood, began to pull away after Michael made an inappropriate comment about her weight at Thanksgiving. "I can't watch you do this," she told me afterward, her voice breaking with frustration. "It's like you're disappearing right in front of me." "You don't understand," I countered, the words hollow even to my own ears. "He needs me." "And who's taking care of you?" she asked, a question that would haunt me long after she walked away. The answer, of course, was no one, least of all myself. I had become a supporting character in my own life, my days structured around Michael's moods, my energy consumed by anticipating his needs, predicting his triggers, managing the fallout of his binges. I stopped wearing bright colors because they hurt his eyes when he was hungover. I learned to cook with minimal noise, to speak in the soft, measured tones one might use in a library or a sick room. I deleted social media apps from my phone after he scrolled through my feed one night, questioning who had liked my photos and what they really wanted from me. Even my body betrayed the truth my mind refused to acknowledge. I developed insomnia, lying awake listening for the sound of his key in the lock, for the telltale crash of a body stumbling against furniture. My hair began falling out in clumps, my skin erupted in stress hives, my period became irregular and then stopped altogether. The doctor diagnosed me with anxiety and depression, prescribing medications I was afraid to take because someone needed to stay vigilant, someone needed to remain clear-headed in our household of 2. "Have you considered that your symptoms might be related to stress at home?" the doctor asked gently, her eyes full of the same knowing concern I'd seen in my mother's, my sister's, my former friends. "We're just going through a rough patch," I said automatically, the words so familiar they had lost all meaning. 6 months before our wedding, I found myself alone in our apartment on a rare evening when Michael was at a client dinner, code for, drinking with colleagues, would stumble home after midnight. I wandered from room to room, touching objects that had once meant something to me, my grandfather's antique chess set, now missing pieces from nights when Michael had knocked it over in a drunken haze, framed photos of friends I no longer spoke to, a guitar I hadn't played since moving in with him because the noise aggravated his headaches. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and stopped short, genuinely startled by the woman staring back at me. Thin to the point of gauntness, dark circles like bruises under dull eyes, hair limp and unwashed. But it wasn't just the physical changes that shocked me, it was the expression, or rather, the lack of one. A blank canvas where a vibrant, hopeful face had once been. "Emma!" I whispered to my reflection, searching for some spark of the woman I used to be. "Are you still in there?" The emptiness that echoed back terrified me more than any of Michael's drunken rages ever had. Because in that moment, I understood what my loved ones had been trying to tell me. I was vanishing, piece by piece, day by day. I picked up my phone and, for the first time in months, called my sister. "I need help," I said when she answered, my voice cracking with the weight of admission. There was a pause, a small intake of breath. I'll be there in 20 minutes. That night, while Michael was out drinking away his demons, I sat with my sister at our kitchen table and told her everything. The escalating drinking, the verbal abuse, the isolation, the shame. With each confession, I felt something stir within me, a small flame of my former self flickering to life. "Come stay with me," she urged, her hand squeezing mine. "Just for a while. Just to clear your head." I looked around the apartment that had become both my sanctuary and my prison. The wedding invitation stacked neatly on the counter, waiting to be mailed. The framed blueprint of our never-to-be-built dream house. The empty bottle of whiskey hidden behind the houseplant, one of many I would dispose of before Michael woke the next morning. "I can't leave him," I said finally, the flame inside me dimming. "He needs me. Who would take care of him if I left?" My sister's face crumpled with a grief I didn't yet understand. "Who will take care of you if you stay?" I had no answer then, too lost in the addiction that had become my own, not to alcohol, but to the desperate belief that my love could save him, that my sacrifice meant something, that tomorrow would be different. I walked my sister to the door, promised to think about what she'd said, then went to bed alone in the home I shared with a man who was slowly killing both of us in different but equally devastating ways. I didn't know then that it would take another year of disappearing, of losing even more pieces of myself, before I would finally understand the truth my sister tried to show me that night. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the addict you love, is to walk away. They say there's a moment, a single, crystallizing instant, when you finally understand you cannot save someone who doesn't want to be saved. For some, it's finding their partner unconscious. For others, it's a violent outburst that crosses an unforgivable line. For me, it was something quieter but no less devastating. It happened 3 months before our wedding was scheduled to take place. I'd mailed the invitations, secured the venue, chosen the flowers, all with a mechanical detachment, as if planning someone else's celebration. Deep down, I knew we wouldn't make it to the altar, not like this, but admitting that truth seemed more painful than continuing the charade. Michael had been drinking more heavily than usual that month. His firm had lost a major project bid, and his supervisor had pulled him aside to discuss his unprofessional behavior at client meetings. The pressure was mounting, and as always, he turned to the bottle for relief. I came home from work one Tuesday evening to find him already drunk, slumped on the couch, an almost empty fifth of vodka on the coffee table. This was new. Hard liquor on a weeknight, not even attempting to hide it. Another line crossed. "Hey," I said carefully, setting my bag down, assessing his mood with the practiced eye of someone who has learned to navigate minefields. "Rough day." He looked up at me with unfocused eyes. "Your sister called. Wanted to know if we'd gotten her RSVP." My heart sank. After our conversation months ago, my sister had kept her distance, respecting my decision to stay while making it clear she'd be there when I was ready to leave. The wedding invitation had been an olive branch, a desperate attempt to keep one thread connected to my former life. "I'll call her back tomorrow," I said, moving toward the kitchen, already calculating how to minimize conflict, how to get through the evening intact. "Already told her to go to hell," he slurred, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Told her she wasn't welcome after the way she's treated me." I froze, the familiar icy dread washing over me. "You did what?" "She thinks I'm not good enough for you," he said, his voice rising. "Always has. Well, guess what? She doesn't get to come to our wedding." Problem solved. I stood there, my coat still on, keys still in hand, as something inside me finally, irrevocably broke. Not because he'd lashed out at my sister. He'd done worse in his alcoholic rages. Not even because he'd made a unilateral decision about our wedding. It was because in that moment, I realized I didn't want him at our wedding either. I didn't want to marry this man. I didn't want to spend my life managing his addiction, making excuses for his behavior, shrinking myself to accommodate his disease. The thought came with such clarity, such certainty, that it left me breathless. "There's not going to be a wedding," I heard myself say, my voice steady in a way it hadn't been for years. He squinted at me, confusion and anger warring on his face. "What are you talking about?" "I'm done, Michael. I can't do this anymore." He staggered to his feet, the familiar transformation happening before my eyes. Hurt giving way to rage, vulnerability hardening into cruelty. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice dangerously low. You think anyone else would put up with your neurotic bullshit? Your pathetic neediness? I'm the best thing that ever happened to you. Once, those words would have cut deep, would have made me question my worth, my judgment, my right to want something better. But in that moment, they sounded like what they truly were, the desperate lies of a drowning man trying to pull me under with him. I'm staying at Lisa's tonight, I said, referring to a work colleague who'd offered her guest room months ago, an offer I dismissed then but had kept like a secret talisman. I'll come back for my things this weekend. If you leave now, don't bother coming back, he threatened, his voice slurring but his eyes suddenly sharp with panic. I mean it, Emma. Walk out that door and we're done. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man I'd fallen in love with, but the disease that had consumed him. The alcohol that had hollowed him out and filled the space with rage and fear and denial. We've been done for a long time, I said softly. I just couldn't admit it until now. I turned and walked out the door, his shouts following me down the hallway, threats giving way to pleas, rage melting into promises I'd heard too many times before. I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, out of the building and into the cool evening air. I expected to feel grief, guilt, the crushing weight of failure. Instead, I felt something so unfamiliar it took me several blocks to recognize it: relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief, like surfacing after being underwater too long, lungs burning with the sweet agony of oxygen. I called Lisa from a coffee shop 3 blocks away, my hands shaking not with fear but with a strange, giddy energy. I left him, I said when she answered, the words still unreal on my tongue. Can I still take you up on that guest room? I'll text you my address, she said without hesitation. Do you need me to come get you? No, I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I can get there on my own. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls, 29 text messages ranging from apologetic to threatening, and 1 voicemail from Michael that I deleted without listening to. I'd been down this road before, the remorse, the promises, the temporary improvements that never lasted. What I hadn't anticipated was the speed and efficiency with which he switched tactics when he realized I was serious. Within days, he called my mother, my friends, even my boss, spinning a tale of my supposed mental breakdown, claiming I needed help and intervention. He seems really worried about you, my boss said cautiously, cornering me by the coffee machine. Said you've been under a lot of stress lately. I have been, I admitted, a strange calm settling over me. That's why I left him. The puzzlement on her face would have been comical if it wasn't so telling of how successfully I'd hidden the truth from everyone in my life. Michael has a drinking problem, I said, the words still difficult to form even now. It's been going on for years. I couldn't help him, and I was losing myself trying. Her expression shifted from confusion to understanding, then to something that looked like respect. Take whatever time you need, she said, squeezing my arm. Your job will be here when you're ready. That conversation was the first of many over the following weeks, painful, honest discussions with the people I'd shut out while trying to manage Michael's addiction. Some, like my mother and sister, welcomed me back with open arms and no recriminations. Others, particularly mutual friends who'd only seen Michael's charming public persona, were skeptical of my sudden decision to end our engagement. He seemed so devastated. One friend told me over coffee, a meetup that would turn out to be our last. Maybe if you gave him one more chance. I gave him 3 years of chances, I replied, no longer willing to minimize the reality of what I'd endured. How many more would be enough? She had no answer, and I realized then that some relationships wouldn't survive my newfound commitment to honesty, and that was okay. I couldn't control others' perceptions any more than I could control Michael's drinking. The hardest part came a month after I left, when Michael showed up at Lisa's apartment, sober and immaculately dressed, a small gift bag in his hand. Just 5 minutes, he pleaded when I answered the door, his eyes clear and earnest in a way that made my heart contract painfully. Please, Emma. Against my better judgment, against Lisa's whispered warnings, I stepped outside to talk with him. The spring air was warm, the street alive with people enjoying the sunshine, a stark contrast to the shadowed existence I'd been living. I've been sober for 27 days, he said, holding out the gift bag. I joined AA. I'm seeing a therapist twice a week. I'm doing the work, Emma. For us. I took the bag mechanically, peering inside to find a small velvet box. Not a ring this time, but a pair of earrings, delicate sapphires that matched the engagement ring I'd left on our kitchen counter the day I moved out. I know I don't deserve another chance, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. But I'm asking for one anyway. I'm fighting for us, Emma. I need you to fight too. For one vertiginous moment, I felt myself wavering. This was the Michael I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable, sincere, trying so hard to be better. This was the man I'd convinced myself was the real person beneath the addiction. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something I hadn't been able to recognize before, a reflection of my own desperation. He wasn't fighting for us. He was fighting for the comfort of having someone who would absorb his pain, manage his disease, shoulder the burden of his recovery. I'm proud of you for getting help, I said finally, handing back the gift bag. But I need to fight for myself now. His face crumpled, the familiar anger flickering behind his eyes. So that's it? 3 years together, and you're just throwing it away. The alcohol threw it away long before I did, I replied, a truth that no longer felt like a betrayal to speak aloud. I hope you stay sober, Michael. I really do. But I can't be the reason you do it. That has to come from you. I went back inside, closing the door on his protests, on the life we'd shared, on the woman I'd been while loving him. I leaned against the door, waiting for the tsunami of regret, of second-guessing, of grief. It never came. Instead, standing in the borrowed living room of a friend who'd witnessed my unraveling and still believed I could be whole again, I felt the first tentative stirrings of something I'd almost forgotten, hope. Not hope that Michael would change, or that our relationship could be salvaged, but hope for myself, for a future where I wasn't defined by someone else's addiction, where I could reclaim the pieces of myself I'd surrendered in the name of love. That night, I called the wedding venue and canceled our reservation, forfeiting the deposit without regret. I deleted the countdown app on my phone that had been ticking away the days until our wedding. I removed his name from my emergency contact information at work. Small acts of liberation, each one a step toward reclaiming my life. Each one a declaration that the breaking point wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new one. A story where I was once again the protagonist, not a supporting character in someone else's tragedy. What I didn't know then was how many more battles lay ahead, how addiction, even when removed from your daily life, leaves scars that don't heal overnight. I didn't know how much work it would take to rebuild what had been broken, not just in my relationships with others, but in my relationship with myself. But for the first time in years, I was ready to find out. They don't tell you about the aftermath when you leave a toxic relationship. No one warns you that freedom, however desperately needed, comes with its own kind of pain. That rebuilding yourself from scattered fragments is a slow, often agonizing process. That addiction touches everything it encounters, leaving invisible residue that clings long after you've walked away. In the months following my departure from Michael's life, I experienced what my therapist would later call emotional whiplash. Violent swings between empowerment and crippling self-doubt, between fierce joy and bottomless grief. Lisa let me stay in her guest room for 6 weeks, far longer than either of us had initially planned. I offered to pay rent, but she refused, saying simply, "You would have done the same for me." I wasn't sure that was true. The woman I'd become while with Michael had grown selfish in her survival, had learned to look away from others' pain to manage her own. But I was determined to become someone worthy of Lisa's faith in me. The first challenge was retrieving my belongings from the apartment I'd shared with Michael. I put it off for as long as possible, dreading the confrontation, the potential for manipulation that had worked so effectively in the past. Finally, Lisa and my sister orchestrated an extraction operation with military precision, scheduling it for a weekday when Michael would be at work, enlisting 2 male friends to help with heavy lifting, getting the super to let us in and supervise. Even so, walking into that apartment felt like stepping back in time. The air still smelled of his cologne mingled with the faint, sour undertone of spilled alcohol. The photos of us still hung on the walls, evidence of a happiness that had been genuine once, before it soured into something unrecognizable. On the counter sat a vase of fresh flowers with a card I didn't read, a final attempt at persuasion I had anticipated and steeled myself against. I moved through the rooms methodically, packing my clothes, my books, the heirloom quilt my grandmother had made me. I left behind anything we had purchased together, unable to separate the objects from the memories they contained. The crystal wine glasses from our housewarming, the expensive coffee maker he'd given me for my birthday, the framed print from our trip to Barcelona before his drinking escalated from problematic to dangerous. My sister found me staring at that print, lost in remembering how happy we'd been that week, how for 7 sun-drenched days the alcohol had taken a back seat to museums and tapas and walks along the waterfront. "You okay?" she asked, her hand gentle on my shoulder. "I did love him," I said, the admission catching in my throat. "That wasn't a lie." "Of course you did," she replied, her voice soft with understanding. "No one stays in something like this unless the love is real." That validation, the acknowledgement that my feelings hadn't been a delusion or a character flaw, broke something open inside me. I wept then, not for the relationship I was leaving, but for the one I had wanted so desperately, the future I had planned with a man who existed only in fleeting moments of sobriety. My sister held me while I cried, there in the half-empty apartment with its ghosts of broken promises. When the storm passed, she helped me finish packing, and we left without looking back, the door closing with a finality that was both devastating and necessary. The second challenge was managing Michael's continued attempts to pull me back into his orbit. 4 weeks, he alternated between strategies, remorseful messages about his sobriety one day, thinly veiled threats about self-harm the next, accusations of abandonment followed by declarations of undying love. Each message was designed to hit a specific emotional target, to exploit the caretaker in me that had kept me bound to him for so long. Under my therapist's guidance, I established a communication blackout. I blocked his number, his email, his social media accounts. I asked mutual friends not to relay messages or updates about his life. I changed my routines, finding new coffee shops, grocery stores, running paths to avoid accidental encounters. These precautions weren't just about preventing Michael from manipulating me back into the relationship. They were about creating space for my own healing, uncontaminated by his presence or influence. They were about learning who Emma was when she wasn't defined by someone else's addiction. And that was the third, most daunting challenge, rediscovering myself after years of self-erasure. I'd spent so long contorting myself to fit Michael's needs that I'd forgotten my own. What foods did I actually enjoy? What music made me happy? What were my opinions on politics, religion, the best way to spend a Saturday afternoon? These questions, once so easily answered, now felt like complex riddles. The journey back to myself began with small reclamations. I dyed my hair the bright auburn I'd always wanted, but Michael had dismissed as too attention-seeking. I signed up for a kickboxing class, channeling years of suppressed anger into each punch and kick. I bought plants for my new studio apartment, living things that I alone was responsible for nurturing. Recovery isn't linear, my therapist reminded me in our weekly sessions, a mantra I clung to on days when the pull to check on Michael, to make sure he was okay, became almost unbearable. There will be setbacks. The important thing is to keep moving forward. One such setback came 3 months after I left, when I ran into Michael's sister at the farmer's market. We'd always gotten along well, and the genuine concern in her eyes broke through the careful armor I'd constructed. "How is he?" I asked before I could stop myself, hating the tremor in my voice. She hesitated, weighing her words. "He's been in and out of rehab. 30 days sober, then a relapse. He's trying, I think. Just not consistently." I nodded, unsurprised yet still disappointed. In my darkest moments of self-doubt, I had wondered if my leaving would be the wake-up call he needed, if my absence would accomplish what my presence never could. It was a dangerous line of thinking, one that placed responsibility for his recovery back on my shoulders, where it had never belonged. "And you?" she asked, her eyes kind. "How are you doing?" "I'm getting there," I said, surprised to find I meant it. "Some days are harder than others." She squeezed my hand. "I want you to know, our family doesn't blame you. We saw what you went through, what you put up with. No one could have done more." Her absolution, freely given when I hadn't dared to ask for it, was a gift I carried with me for weeks afterward, a talisman against the guilt that still ambushed me in unguarded moments. 6 months after leaving Michael, I received a letter, an actual paper letter, postmarked from a rehabilitation center 2 states away. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope, and my first instinct was to throw it away unopened, to protect the fragile peace I had been building. But my therapist had been working with me on distinguishing between avoidance and boundary setting, between running from the past and moving consciously away from it. With her encouragement, I opened the letter one evening in the safety of her office. It was step 9 of his recovery program, making amends to those he had harmed. 4 handwritten pages of acknowledgement, not just of the obvious instances of hurt, but of the subtle erosions, how he had isolated me from my support system, how he had used my empathy as a weapon against me, how his denial had forced me to question my own reality. There was no request for reconciliation, no hint that he expected or even wanted a response. Just a simple closing line. I hope someday you find the happiness you deserved all along. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, a peculiar sense of completion washing over me. 4 years, I had waited for him to see what was happening to us, to acknowledge the damage his drinking was causing. Now he had, and ironically, it came only after there was no more us to save. "How do you feel?" my therapist asked gently. I considered the question, probing my emotions like a tongue exploring a wound that had finally begun to heal. "Validated," I said finally. Like I wasn't crazy all those times I tried to explain what was happening. Like it was real. She nodded, understanding what I couldn't fully articulate. That one of the cruelest aspects of loving an addict is the gaslighting, the constant denial that forces you to question your own perceptions, your own worth, your own right to want something better. "And sad," I continued, surprised by the tears that sprang to my eyes. Because even now, even after everything, part of me still wishes things could have been different. "That's the nature of grief," she said. "We don't just mourn what was, we mourn what could have been." It was the permission I needed to finally acknowledge the full scope of my loss, not just the relationship itself, but the future I had imagined, the children we might have had, the life I had spent years trying to manifest through sheer force of will. That night, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do since leaving Michael. I took out the shoebox of mementos I'd impulsively grabbed during my move-out, ticket stubs from concerts we'd attended, a pressed flower from our first Valentine's Day, the napkin on which he'd scribbled his phone number the night we met. I spread these artifacts of a failed love across my bedroom floor, touching each one, remembering the hope it had once represented. Then, in a ritual that felt both ancient and necessary, I wrote a letter of my own, not to Michael but to myself. A letter documenting what I had learned, what I had survived, what I would carry forward, and what I would leave behind. When I finished writing, I gathered the mementos and the letter into a small metal trash can and carried it to the fire escape of my apartment building. Under the vast indifference of the night sky, I struck a match and watched as the physical evidence of our relationship curled and blackened and finally disintegrated into ash. It wasn't about erasing Michael from my history. That would be impossible and, in its own way, another form of denial. It was about releasing my attachment to what might have been, about accepting that love, no matter how genuine, is not always enough to save someone from their demons. As I watched the last embers die, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying, the burden of responsibility for someone else's healing. For the first time since I'd met Michael, I felt truly, completely free. Not just of the relationship, but of the belief that had kept me tethered to it long past its expiration, that my love was the antidote to his addiction. The truth, as painful as it was liberating, was that it never had been. And in accepting that truth, I found the beginning of my own recovery, not from alcohol, but from the particular addiction that had consumed me, the desperate need to fix what was broken in someone else, rather than tending to what was broken in myself. The aftermath of loving an alcoholic did not end that night on the fire escape. In many ways, it continues even now, years later, in the reflexive apologies I sometimes catch myself making, in the hypervigilance that flares when someone I care about has one too many drinks at dinner, in the work I must constantly do to believe that I am worthy of a love that doesn't hurt. But that night marked a turning point, the moment I stopped seeing myself as a casualty of someone else's disease and began to recognize my own resilience, my own capacity for growth, my own right to a life unburdened by the weight of another's choices. The aftermath, I was beginning to understand, could also be a beginning. 1 year after leaving Michael, I was convinced I'd healed. I had my own apartment, decorated exactly as I liked with bright colors and mismatched furniture he would have hated. I'd been promoted at work, the focus and ambition that had once defined me resurging with unexpected force. I'd reconciled with friends, rebuilt my relationship with my family, even started dating again. Casual coffees and dinners with men who seemed steady, reliable, free from the chaos that had characterized my life with Michael. "You've made remarkable progress," my therapist told me during our now monthly sessions. "How do you feel about where you are?" "Great," I said automatically, the response expected of someone who had successfully escaped a toxic relationship. I barely think about him anymore. It wasn't entirely a lie. The acute pain had faded, the constant preoccupation with his well-being diminished. I could go days, sometimes weeks, without wondering if he was sober, if he was happy, if he'd found someone new to absorb the impact of his disease. But there was a hollow space inside me that I couldn't seem to fill, a lingering unease that shadowed even my happiest moments. I attributed it to normal post-trauma recovery, to the expected aftershocks of having loved and left an addict. I told myself it would pass with time, with more therapy, with enough new experiences to overwrite the painful ones. What I didn't recognize, what I wouldn't acknowledge until it nearly destroyed me, was that I had merely traded one addiction for another. My drinking had never been problematic during my relationship with Michael. In fact, I'd often abstained entirely, hyper-aware of the contrast between my controlled sipping and his rapid descent into intoxication. I'd been the responsible one, the designated driver, the voice of moderation and reason. Perhaps that's why I didn't notice how quickly alcohol became my coping mechanism after I left him. It started innocuously enough: a glass of wine while cooking dinner, a cocktail with colleagues after work, a nightcap to help me sleep when memories kept me awake. But gradually, imperceptibly, one glass became two, became a bottle. The nightcap became necessary rather than occasional. The pleasant buzz that once helped me relax became a state I actively sought, then craved, then needed. I hid it well, as those who love alcoholics often do. I knew the warning signs, after all. I knew how to function, how to maintain appearances, how to rationalize increased consumption as just a phase, or well-deserved relaxation after what I'd been through. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in my most intoxicated moments. I had left a man whose drinking had nearly destroyed me, only to find myself reaching for the same poison as a balm for my wounds. The spiral accelerated after a particularly difficult day, the would-have-been date of my wedding to Michael. I had planned to spend it with friends, to reclaim the day with new, better memories. But as the hours ticked by, I found myself making excuses to be alone, to nurse the peculiar grief that still ambushed me at unexpected moments. That night, I drank until the room spun, until my carefully reconstructed defenses crumbled, until I found myself doing the one thing I had promised myself I would never do. I called Michael. He answered on the second ring, his voice instantly familiar yet somehow changed, steadier, perhaps, or simply older. "Emma," he said, surprise and concern mingling in those two syllables. The sound of my name in his mouth unleashed a torrent of emotion I thought I'd processed and packed away. I wept incoherently, words spilling out in a jumbled confession of loneliness, of fear that I would never fully recover from loving him, of anger that he had marked me so indelibly with his disease. He listened in silence until my tears subsided into hiccuping breaths. "Are you drunk?" he asked finally, the question free from judgment but piercing in its accuracy. "No." I lied automatically then. "Yes." "I don't know. Does it matter?" There was a long pause, the kind that used to terrify me when we lived together, when I never knew if silence portended rage or withdrawal. "It matters," he said quietly, "because I'm sober now. 8 months and 16 days. And I can't have this conversation with you when you're not." The statement hit me with the force of a physical blow. The role reversal was too stark, too painful to process through the haze of alcohol. "I'm sorry," I managed, humiliation rising hot in my chest. "I shouldn't have called." "No, you shouldn't have," he agreed, his voice gentle but firm. "Not like this. Get some water, Emma. Get some sleep. Take care of yourself." He hung up, leaving me alone with the devastating realization that while I had been congratulating myself on escaping the orbit of his addiction, I had been slowly, steadily falling into one of my own. The next morning, I woke to a pounding headache and the crystal-clear memory of my midnight call. Shame washed over me in nauseating waves as I scrolled through my phone log, confirming that the conversation hadn't been a nightmare but a humiliating reality. I dragged myself to the bathroom, avoiding my reflection in the mirror as I fumbled for pain relievers. The irony of my situation was so profound it would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. Michael was sober. I was not. He was in recovery. I was spiraling. That morning, through the fog of my hangover, I made 2 decisions that would alter the course of my life. First, I poured every drop of alcohol in my apartment down the drain, wine, vodka, even the cooking sherry I kept for special recipes. Second, I called my therapist and requested an emergency session. I think I have a problem, I told her that afternoon, the words so familiar from the other side of the equation, yet so foreign on my tongue. I think I'm using alcohol the way Michael used to numb myself, to escape. She nodded, her expression compassionate but not surprised. This isn't uncommon, Emma. Those who love addicts are at higher risk of developing addictive behaviors themselves. The patterns become normalized, almost contagious. But I knew better, I protested, anger at myself sharpening my voice. I saw what it did to him, to us. How could I let myself go down the same path? Because trauma doesn't respond to logic, she said simply. It finds release wherever it can. And sometimes, we're drawn to the very thing that hurt us as a way of trying to understand it, to master it. That explanation, that my drinking wasn't a character flaw or a weakness, but a misguided attempt by my psyche to process what had happened to me, opened a door I hadn't known was closed. It allowed me to approach my behavior with the same compassion I'd once attempted to show Michael, to see it not as a moral failing, but as a maladaptive coping mechanism born of genuine pain. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in understanding my relationship with alcohol, with addiction in general. I joined a support group specifically for partners and family members of alcoholics, where I heard story after story that mirrored my own, people who had escaped toxic relationships only to find themselves trapped in patterns of behavior that echoed what they had fled. We call it the secondhand disease, one woman told me after a particularly emotional meeting. You spend so long orbiting someone else's addiction that you forget where they end and you begin. Their habits become your habits. Their rationalizations become your rationalizations. This framework, understanding my drinking not as an isolated problem but as part of the larger fallout from my relationship with Michael, helped me address not just the symptom but the underlying wound. In therapy, I began to excavate the beliefs that had led me first to stay with an alcoholic far past the point of health, then to seek solace in the very substance that had destroyed our relationship. The work was excruciating. It required facing truths about myself that were far more difficult to accept than any of Michael's flaws had been. It meant acknowledging that part of me had been drawn to his brokenness, had found purpose and identity in being the stable one, the savior, the martyr. It meant confronting my own childhood, a father lost to alcohol, a mother who had alternated between enabling and ultimatums, and how those early experiences had shaped my understanding of love as something that required suffering to be genuine. 3 months into my own sobriety journey, I received a text from Michael. My first instinct was to delete it unread, to protect the fragile equilibrium I was building. But my therapist had been encouraging me to trust my judgment again, to practice discernment rather than avoidance. The message was brief. I owe you an apology for how I handled your call that night. I was harsh when you were hurting. That wasn't right. I hope you're well. I stared at those words for a long time, turning them over in my mind, searching for the manipulation, the hidden hook designed to pull me back into his life. But I found none. Just a simple acknowledgement of a moment when he could have been kinder and wasn't. I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on the truth. Thank you for that. I've been working on my own relationship with alcohol. It's been eye-opening. His reply came quickly. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most important. If you ever want to talk, sober, I'm here. No expectations. I never took him up on that offer. Not because I feared falling back into our toxic patterns, but because I had come to understand that our journeys, however parallel, needed to unfold separately. We had been too deeply entangled, our identities too enmeshed, for us to help each other heal. The most loving thing we could do for both of us was to maintain the distance that allowed us to become whole on our own terms. That realization marked a turning point in my recovery, both from the relationship and from my flirtation with alcoholism. For the first time, I could see Michael not as the villain of my story, nor as the lost love I had failed to save, but simply as another flawed human being doing his best to overcome the same disease that had nearly claimed me. The compassion I felt for him then was different from the desperate, self-sacrificing kind that had kept me bound to him for years. It was cleaner, healthier, the compassion of one survivor for another, free from the obligation to fix or save. As my second year of independence approached, I found myself in a place I had never imagined possible in the dark days after leaving Michael. I was sober, not white-knuckling through each day, but genuinely at peace with my decision to abstain from alcohol. I was rebuilding my career, my friendships, my sense of self. I was even cautiously entering a new relationship with a man who had his own history of loving an addict, who understood the scars such love leaves behind. But perhaps most importantly, I had stopped seeing myself as a victim of Michael's disease and started recognizing my own role in our dynamic, not to assign blame, but to reclaim my power, to ensure I would never again mistake self-annihilation for love. One evening, as I sat on the small balcony of my apartment watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a memory from a social media app, a photo taken 5 years earlier, in what I now recognized as the honeymoon phase of my relationship with Michael. We were at a friend's wedding, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling into the camera with the uncomplicated joy of people who believed their love was invincible. I studied our faces, searching for signs of what was to come, the addiction that would consume him, the codependency that would nearly destroy me. But all I saw were two young people with no idea of the pain that awaited them, the growth that would come only through suffering. I felt no urge to call Michael, no desire to revisit the past, no spike of the grief that had once been my constant companion. Instead, I felt a quiet compassion for those two strangers in the photograph, for the man who didn't yet know how completely alcohol would ravage his life, for the woman who didn't yet understand that love, however genuine, cannot heal someone who isn't ready to heal themselves. Be gentle with yourselves, I whispered to the fading image on my screen. The journey ahead is harder than you can imagine, but you'll both survive it. And eventually, in your own ways, you'll find your way back to wholeness. I closed the app and turned my attention back to the sunset, to the present moment, to the life I was rebuilding one day at a time. A life that no longer revolved around someone else's addiction or recovery. A life that was mine alone, hard-won, imperfect, but finally authentically free. 3 years after leaving Michael, I found myself sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room, staring at institutional beige walls as my mother underwent surgery for breast cancer. The doctors were optimistic. They had caught it early. Her prognosis was good, but the fragility of life had never felt more apparent than in that moment, waiting for news about the woman who had raised me, who had survived her own toxic marriage to my alcoholic father decades before I repeated her pattern. It was there, amid the antiseptic smell and muted television broadcasting news no one was watching, that I began to truly understand the generational nature of addiction and codependency, not just as abstract concepts discussed in therapy or support groups, but as a tangible inheritance passed down through my family like eye color or height. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister, stuck in traffic but on her way. To pass the time, I found myself scrolling through old family photos stored in my cloud account. There was my mother in her 20s, dark-haired and laughing beside my father, his arm slung casually around her shoulders, a beer bottle dangling from his other hand. There I was at 5, sitting on his lap while he read me a story, his face younger than mine was now, unlined by the years of drinking that would eventually claim his life. I paused on a particular photo, my parents' wedding day. They stood beneath an archway of flowers, my mother radiant in a lace gown, my father handsome in his tuxedo. Their faces shone with the same hope, the same certainty I had felt when Michael proposed to me almost exactly 30 years later. "Emma!" I looked up to find Dr. Levine, my mother's surgeon, standing before me in blue scrubs. My heart lurched before I registered her small, reassuring smile. "The surgery went well," she said. sitting beside me. "We got clean margins. Your mother's in recovery now. You can see her in about 20 minutes." Relief flooded through me, momentarily washing away the strange melancholy that had settled over me while looking at the old photographs. I thanked her, texted my sister the good news, then returned to the wedding photo still displayed on my phone. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what my mother had been thinking in that moment, what dreams she had harbored for her future with my father, what warnings she might have ignored, what signs of his disease might already have been present, dismissed as pre-wedding jitters or youthful high spirits. When I was finally allowed into my mother's recovery room, I found her groggy but alert, her normally vibrant face pale against the hospital pillows. I kissed her forehead, arranged the flowers I'd brought, helped her sip water through a straw. "You look serious," she murmured, her voice rough from the intubation tube. "I'm okay, you know. They got it all." I nodded, swallowing around the sudden lump in my throat. "I know. I was just thinking about Dad." Her eyebrows rose, slightly in surprise. We rarely spoke of my father, even after my experience with Michael had created a bridge of understanding between us. The pain of his loss, not just his physical death, but the years of emotional absence before it, remained a tender spot for both of us. "What about him?" she asked cautiously. I showed her the wedding photo on my phone. "Were you happy that day? Really happy? Or were there already signs?" My mother studied the image, her expression softening with memory. "I was deliriously happy," she said finally. "And yes, there were signs. His best man had to help him get ready because he was too hungover from the bachelor party. He had a flask in his jacket pocket during the ceremony. But I thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. "You thought you could fix him," I finished for her. "That your love would be enough." She reached for my hand, her fingers cool and fragile against mine. "Just like you did with Michael. Just like my mother did with my father." She smiled sadly. "The women in our family have a type, it seems." That conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in my healing journey, not just from my relationship with Michael, but from the deeper patterns that had made that relationship possible, even inevitable. Over the weeks of my mother's recovery, as I helped her through chemotherapy appointments and radiation treatments, we began to unravel the tangled threads of addiction that ran through our family history. I learned that my maternal grandfather, whom I'd never met, had been a functioning alcoholic who held down a respectable job as a bank manager while drinking himself to sleep every night. I heard stories about my paternal great-uncle who lost his family, his home, and finally his life to the disease. With each revelation, the pieces of my own puzzle fell into place, not as excuse or absolution, but as context, as understanding. "Did you ever wonder," I asked my mother one afternoon as we sat in her garden, harvesting late summer tomatoes, "if alcoholism isn't just a disease of individuals but of relationships? Of entire family systems?" She considered this, her hands stained red with tomato juice. "I think it must be. The drinker needs someone to clean up their messes, to make excuses, to maintain the facade of normalcy. And we, the non-drinkers, we need to be needed. To feel indispensable. To feel superior," I added, the inside sharp with self-recognition. "To have someone whose problems are bigger than our own, so we never have to face them." My mother nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry, Emma. I thought I was protecting you from your father's drinking. But I was showing you how to love an addict instead." I wrapped my arms around her thin shoulders, inhaling the familiar scent of her gardenia perfume mingled with soil and sunshine. "You showed me how to survive, Mom, and eventually how to leave. When I finally walked away from Michael, it was because I remembered that you had walked away from Dad." It was true. Though I had spent years judging my mother for divorcing my father, for abandoning him to his disease, it was her example that had ultimately given me permission to save myself. Her quiet strength, her refusal to be destroyed by my father's addiction, had planted the seed of self-preservation that eventually bloomed in my own life. As my mother's health improved and my caretaking duties diminished, I found myself drawn to understand more deeply the science behind addiction, the psychology of codependency, the epigenetics of trauma that might explain why some families seem caught in cycles of dysfunction while others escape. I enrolled in evening classes in psychology, not with any professional ambitions, but with the urgent desire to comprehend what had happened to me, to Michael, to my parents, to all the others whose lives had been ravaged by addiction. Knowledge became my new addiction, healthier than alcohol or codependency, but pursued with the same relentless intensity. It was through these studies that I encountered Dr. Gabrielle Kane, a researcher specializing in the intersection of addiction and attachment theory. Her lecture series at the community college became the highlight of my week, her insights illuminating dark corners of my experience I hadn't been able to articulate even in years of therapy. Addiction, she explained to our small class of mostly addiction counselors and recovering addicts, is not primarily about the substance or behavior. It's about attachment, about connection, about managing unbearable emotional states. The addict turns to their drug of choice when human connection has failed them or feels too threatening. I raised my hand, suddenly needing to understand something that had haunted me for years. What about the partners of addicts? Those of us who stay far past the point of reason or self-preservation. Are we addicted too? Dr. Kane's gaze was compassionate but unflinching. In many ways, yes. Codependency can be understood as an attachment disorder, a love addiction. The chemical cascade in the brain of someone rescuing an addict, the adrenaline of crisis, the dopamine of temporary resolution, the oxytocin of being needed, can be as powerfully reinforcing as any drug. Her words struck me like physical blows, painful in their accuracy, yet oddly liberating in their clarity. I wasn't weak or stupid for having stayed with Michael. I was responding to neurochemical impulses as powerful and unconscious as those that had driven his drinking. We had been locked in a dance of mutual addiction, each feeding the other's disease. After class, I lingered, wanting to thank Dr. Kane for her insights. To my surprise, she recognized me. "You're Emma Sullivan, aren't you?" she asked. "I read your piece in the Recovery Journal last month. Loving the addict, losing myself. It was beautifully written, painfully honest." I flushed with pleasure at the recognition. The article had been my first attempt to translate my personal experience into something that might help others, a tentative step toward transforming my pain into purpose. "I'm starting a research project," she continued, "on the long-term recovery outcomes for partners of addicts. Would you be interested in participating? Your perspective would be invaluable." That invitation became a turning point in my professional life. What began as a research subject role evolved into a part-time position as Dr. Kane's assistant, then into full-time work at her institute. I discovered that my experiences, combined with my growing knowledge base, allowed me to connect with others in ways that academic credentials alone could not. 4 years after leaving Michael, I found myself leading support groups for partners of addicts, sharing my story and helping others navigate the treacherous waters of loving someone in the grip of addiction. The work was challenging, often heartbreaking, but it gave meaning to the suffering I had endured, transmuting it into wisdom that could light the path for others. One evening, after a particularly emotional group session where a young woman had described her relationship in terms that eerily echoed my own, I found myself lingering in the empty meeting room, straightening chairs and gathering discarded coffee cups. "Do you ever regret it?" The question came from Dr. Kane, who had been observing the session from the back of the room. "Leaving him, I mean." I considered this, allowing myself to really feel into the question rather than offering the reflexive never that had become my standard response. "I regret that we couldn't heal together," I said finally, "that our love couldn't overcome his disease. But I don't regret saving myself. I couldn't set myself on fire to keep him warm forever." She nodded, satisfied with my answer. "And if you could speak to him now, what would you say?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't allowed myself to imagine such a conversation in years, had deliberately avoided creating fantasies of reconciliation or vindication. "I'd tell him that I understand now," I said slowly, surprising myself with the words as they emerged. "That I see his drinking wasn't about me, not a rejection of my love or a reflection of my worth. It was about his pain, his disease, his attachment wounds. And that my staying wasn't really about him either. It was about my own wounds, my own need to be the savior, to prove myself indispensable." I paused, feeling the truth of these words settle into my bones, healing places that had remained tender despite years of therapy and recovery work. "I tell him that I forgive him," I continued, my voice steadier now, "and that I hope he forgives me too, for the times I enabled, for the times I contributed to our toxic cycle, for the ways I tried to control what wasn't mine to control. Dr. Kane smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. You might get that chance. He's registered for next month's joint recovery workshop for addicts and their former partners. I thought you should know before you see his name on the list. My breath caught, a familiar tightening in my chest that I recognized now not as longing or fear, but simply as the body's response to unexpected news. Thank you for telling me, I said, gathering my belongings with hands that trembled only slightly. I'll need to think about whether I'm ready for that. As I drove home that evening, memories of Michael flickered through my mind like scenes from a movie I'd watched long ago, familiar but distant, evocative but no longer viscerally painful. I realized with some surprise that I genuinely hoped he was well, that his recovery had continued, that he had found the peace that had eluded him for so long. More surprising still was the realization that I was no longer afraid of encountering him, no longer worried that seeing him would reawaken the desperate love that had nearly destroyed me. The woman who had left that apartment 3 years ago, rolling her suitcase across the floor while he lay passed out on the couch, was as distant from who I had become as a butterfly from a caterpillar, connected by continuity of existence but transformed beyond recognition. That night, I called my mother, something I did regularly now, our relationship strengthened by our shared journey through illness and recovery. You'll never guess who's going to be at next month's workshop, I said when she answered. Michael! She guessed immediately, her intuition as sharp as ever. Yes, Dr. Kane just told me. I waited for the flood of maternal protectiveness, the warnings to guard my heart, the reminders of all I had suffered. Instead, she asked simply, how do you feel about that? I considered the question, probing my emotions like fingers testing a once broken bone that had finally healed. Curious, I said honestly, a little anxious, but not afraid. Not anymore. That, my mother said, her voice warm with pride, is how I know you've truly recovered. Not because you never think of him, or because you've demonized him, but because you can face the possibility of seeing him without losing yourself in the process. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman who gazed back at me was not the hollow-eyed ghost I had been in the final days with Michael, nor the fragile, wounded creature who had fled his apartment with the few possessions she could carry. This woman stood straight, met her own gaze without flinching, carried in her face the marks of suffering but also of wisdom, of compassion, of hard-won self-respect. This woman understood that addiction was not a moral failing but a disease, that love alone could not heal the wounded, that boundaries were not selfish but necessary for authentic connection. This woman knew that the inheritance of addiction in her family was not a destiny but a challenge, one she could face with clear eyes and an open heart, one she could transform from curse to calling. This woman, I realized with a surge of quiet joy, was finally, genuinely me, not defined by who I had loved or how I had suffered, but by how I had healed, how I had grown, how I had transmuted the lead of toxic love into the gold of self-knowledge and service to others. Whether I chose to attend the workshop and face Michael or not, that transformation was complete and irreversible. The spiral of addiction and codependency that had claimed generations of my family had, at least in my branch of the family tree, been broken. And that, I knew with bone-deep certainty, was a victory that nothing and no one could take from me. I decided to attend the recovery workshop where Michael would be present. Avoiding him would only preserve his power over my choices. When I saw him across the room, 5 years had changed us both. He sat straighter, looked steadier. Our eyes met briefly, a nod, a small smile. No drama, just acknowledgement. The workshop separated us at first, addicts with addicts, partners with partners. I shared openly about my post-relationship drinking and my journey to break generational patterns. Later, we were paired with others' former partners for conversation. I spoke with Julia, 15 years sober, who had lost her marriage and custody of her children. The hardest part, she confessed, is knowing I can never fully make amends. Maybe complete amends isn't the point, I suggested. The past can't be undone, but it can be carried differently. At day's end, Michael approached me. Hello, Emma. Hello, Michael. It's good to see you. And surprisingly, it was. I'm 6 years sober now, he said. After you left, things got worse before they got better. I'm glad, I replied genuinely. You deserve a good life. He told me about his volunteer work helping newly sober people find housing. I shared about my counseling work with partners of addicts. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he said finally, for all of it. And thank you for trying as long as you did and for leaving when you needed to. Both things saved my life in different ways. His words answered questions I'd carried for years. Had anything I'd done mattered? Had my leaving made any difference? Thank you for telling me that, I said simply. Be well, Emma. You too, Michael. That night, I felt no urge to go backward, no lingering attachment, only peace and confirmation of how far I'd come. Some toxic loves leave permanent scars, but this encounter showed me that even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength and wisdom. 6 months after seeing Michael at the workshop, I found myself in a relationship that tested everything I'd learned about healthy love. David was kind, stable, and sober, everything Michael hadn't been. Yet I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. When David was late, my mind conjured images of him passed out somewhere. When he declined a drink at dinner, I scrutinized his expression for signs of inner struggle. When he grew quiet, I assumed he was hiding something. You're treating me like I'm him, David finally said one night after I'd interrogated him about a missed call. I'm not an alcoholic, Emma. I'm not going to suddenly change into someone else. His words hit me like cold water. I'd been so focused on avoiding another Michael that I was poisoning something potentially beautiful. I'm sorry, I whispered. Old habits. I understand your past, he said gently. But at some point, you have to decide if you're going to live there or here with me. That night, I called my sponsor. The thing about trauma, she explained, is that it doesn't just change what happened to you. It changes how you see what might happen. Your brain is trying to protect you from being hurt again. So how do I stop it? I asked. You don't stop it. You notice it. You name it. This is my trauma speaking. Then you choose differently. Over the following months, I practiced this vigilance, not of David's behavior, but of my own reactions. When fear whispered that history was repeating, I acknowledged it, then deliberately chose trust. Not blind trust, but the clear-eyed kind that assesses reality rather than projecting the past onto the present. At work, I found myself drawing on this personal experience to help others. The women in my support group often struggled with the same fears, unable to believe that safe, healthy love was possible after what they'd endured. The hardest part of recovery, I told them, isn't leaving the toxic relationship. It's believing you deserve something better. One evening after group, a new member approached me. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. My husband's been sober for 3 months, she said. He's trying so hard, going to meetings, seeing a therapist. But I keep waiting for him to relapse. I can't relax, can't trust it. How do I know if I should stay? I considered her question carefully, aware of its weight. 5 years ago, I might have automatically advised her to leave, projecting my experience onto hers. Now I knew better. Only you can answer that, I said gently. But ask yourself, are you both healing, or just one of you? Is he taking responsibility, or expecting you to carry it? Are you staying out of love or fear? How did you know it was time to leave? She pressed. When I realized I was disappearing, I replied. When staying hurt more than the fear of leaving. She nodded, tears spilling. Thank you for not telling me what to do. That's the thing about toxic love, I said. It takes away your choices. Real healing means reclaiming them. That conversation stayed with me as David and I grew closer. 1 year into our relationship, he proposed. Not in a grand gesture, but during a quiet moment while hiking, the mountains spread before us like a promise. I hesitated only briefly before saying yes. Not because I doubted him, but because I needed to check in with myself. Was I choosing this from love or fear? From wholeness or emptiness? The answer came with surprising clarity. I wanted this partnership not because I needed David to complete me or save me, but because together we were building something healthy and real. Later that month, I received an unexpected email from Michael. He was moving across the country for a new job and wanted to say goodbye. Attached was a photo of a building he designed, a recovery center with clean lines and light-filled spaces. Thought you might appreciate seeing this, he wrote. The best thing that came from my worst times. I showed the email to David, watching his face carefully. I'd been honest about my past from the beginning, but this was different, a tangible connection to a painful history. "Beautiful building," he said simply. "Are you going to respond?" "Yes," I decided, to wish him well. And I did. A brief message of appreciation for sharing his work, congratulations on the new job, genuine wishes for his continued recovery. No lingering attachment, no reopened wounds. Just one healed person acknowledging another's journey. That night, I dreamed of the early days with Michael, the laughter, the connection, the hope, but for the first time, these memories came without pain. They were simply part of my story, neither romanticized nor demonized. I woke understanding that true healing isn't about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't matter. It's about integrating it into your story with compassion, for yourself, for the person you were then, for the person who hurt you. As David and I planned our future together, I found myself grateful for everything, even the darkest chapters of my journey with Michael. Without that pain, I might never have discovered my strength, my purpose, my capacity for genuine, healthy love. The echoes of toxic love would always be there, faint reverberations that occasionally made themselves known. But they no longer controlled the music of my life. That belonged to me alone, the melody I was creating, day by day, choice by choice, with the clear vision that only comes from having once been blind. 10 years after leaving Michael, I found myself standing before a room of college students, invited to guest lecture in a psychology course on addiction and family systems. The professor had read an article I'd published about my experience and thought the students would benefit from hearing firsthand about the impact of loving an alcoholic. Addiction doesn't just happen to individuals, I told them. It happens to families, to relationships, to entire systems of people who love each other. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "How do you know when to stay and when to leave?" I paused, considering. When staying costs you your sense of self. When you're working harder on someone else's recovery than they are. When love becomes a prison rather than a shelter. After the lecture, she approached me privately. "My boyfriend drinks a lot," she confessed. "He says he can stop any time, but whenever I bring it up, we fight. I'm starting to feel like maybe I'm the problem." I recognized myself in her words, the doubt, the self-blame, the confusion. "You're not the problem," I said gently. "But you can't be his solution either." I gave her resources, support group information, and my card. "Whatever you decide, remember that his drinking isn't about you, and you deserve to be whole." Walking to my car afterward, I called David. "How did it go?" he asked. "Good, I think. There was this girl, though, reminded me so much of myself at that age." "You helped her see a different possibility," he said. "That matters." That night, I looked through old photos, not of Michael, but of myself throughout the years. The hollowed-out woman I'd been when I finally left. The tentative rebuilding in the years after. The steady strength that had gradually returned to my eyes. The journey from toxic love to healthy love wasn't a straight line but a spiral, sometimes seeming to circle back, but always moving upward, always gaining perspective. Every woman I helped, every story I shared, every moment of genuine partnership with David, all of it honored the pain I'd endured without letting it define me. Loving an alcoholic had nearly destroyed me. But in rebuilding myself, I discovered a resilience I never knew I possessed and a purpose that transformed suffering into meaning. That, perhaps, was the most unexpected gift of my toxic love, the discovery that even our deepest wounds, when tended with courage and compassion, can become wellsprings of healing, not just for ourselves, but for others walking the same difficult path. If you're listening to my story and seeing reflections of your own life, this final part is especially for you. I've shared my journey from the intoxicating beginning with Michael through the darkest valleys of addiction and codependency to the painful but necessary end, and finally to healing and renewal. But stories like mine aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be heeded. The signs of toxic love are rarely obvious at first. They creep in gradually, like twilight darkening, so slowly you don't notice night has fallen until you can barely see. Here's what I wish someone had told me, what I want you to know. When someone consistently makes you question your reality, telling you that what you saw didn't happen, that what you heard wasn't said, that's gaslighting and it's abuse. When someone's love feels conditional on your managing their emotions, solving their problems, or sacrificing your needs, that's not love, it's exploitation. When you find yourself becoming smaller, quieter, less vibrant to accommodate someone else's demons, that's not compromise, it's erasure. When you're working harder on someone's recovery than they are, that's not loyalty, it's codependency. I stayed with Michael for 3 years, believing that leaving would be an act of abandonment, a failure of love. I couldn't see that staying was abandoning myself. The most profound truth I've learned is this: you cannot love someone into wellness. You cannot sacrifice enough, understand enough, forgive enough to cure another person's addiction. That power doesn't exist within you or anyone else. It resides solely within the addict themselves. This doesn't mean addicts don't deserve compassion. Addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. But compassion doesn't require martyrdom. Understanding doesn't demand self-destruction. You can acknowledge someone's pain without becoming its casualty. If you recognize yourself in my story, if you're walking on eggshells, making excuses, shrinking your world to manage someone else's addiction, please hear me. This is not what love is supposed to feel like. Real love expands you. It doesn't diminish you. Real love respects boundaries. It doesn't dissolve them. Real love encourages growth. It doesn't require stagnation. Real love feels like freedom, not captivity. You deserve that kind of love. Not someday, when they get sober. Not if you just try harder, love better, sacrifice more. Now, as you are. Leaving isn't easy. I won't pretend it is. There will be guilt, grief, moments of paralyzing doubt. The addiction has trained you to believe you're responsible for their well-being. You're not. Start small. Reach out to someone you trust, a friend, family member, counselor. Say the truth aloud. I'm in a relationship with an addict, and I'm suffering. Breaking the silence breaks the spell. Find support. Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, individual therapy with someone who understands addiction and trauma. These aren't luxuries, they're lifelines. Set boundaries. They don't have to be permanent initially. I won't be around you when you're drinking. I won't lie to cover for you anymore. I need space to think clearly. Each boundary you set and maintain strengthens your sense of self. Reclaim small pieces of your identity. What did you love before the addiction consumed your life? What made you feel like yourself? Find those things again, one tiny step at a time. And if you decide to leave, when you decide to leave, know this: it isn't selfish. It isn't abandonment. It's self-preservation, and sometimes it's the most loving act possible for both of you. I can't promise that leaving will be their rock bottom, that your absence will catalyze their recovery. Michael did eventually get sober, but that wasn't because of my leaving, it was despite it. His healing was his journey, just as mine was my own. What I can promise is this: on the other side of toxic love lies the possibility of reclaiming yourself, of discovering that you are worthy of relationships that nurture rather than deplete you, of building a life where your value isn't measured by how much suffering you can endure. 10 years after leaving, I still carry scars from my time with Michael. Certain triggers still activate old fears. I still sometimes have to remind myself that normal relationship conflicts aren't harbingers of impending disaster. Healing isn't a destination, it's a practice, a daily choice to honor your truth. But those scars no longer define me. They're simply evidence that I survived something that could have destroyed me and emerged stronger, wiser, more authentically myself. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Choose yourself. Not out of selfishness or bitterness, but because your life matters. Your happiness matters. Your wholeness matters. The decision that seems impossible today will become the foundation upon which you rebuild your life tomorrow. The step you're afraid to take leads to a freedom you can barely imagine. I know because I've walked this path. From the woman who rolled her suitcase past her unconscious fiancé, terrified of the unknown future, to the woman who stands before you now, whole, healed, and helping others find their way out of the darkness. You are not alone. You are not trapped. And you are so much stronger than you know. Choose yourself. The rest will follow. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to your own situation, please subscribe. Your subscription isn't just a number to me. It's a message that stories of survival matter, that speaking truth about addiction matters. Hit that notification bell if you want more raw, honest conversations about the relationships we don't talk about enough. Every subscription gives me the courage to keep sharing the darkest parts of my journey to help others find their light.